So today's session, this is session two of three. This is our blueprint for email security platforms. So within this session, we are going to kind of emphasize a couple of the key points that we learned yesterday, where we were talking about the actual attack types. We were talking about the types of threats that you're kind of dealing with. Today, we're going to go into how do we actually deal with those threats. What's the architecture that we should be looking at? How do we choose the right sort of architecture? And then we'll look at what sort of role that AI has in our defensive strategy, right? What sort of innovations do we need to be thinking about deploying and leveraging in our environments in order to defend against some of those latest tactics and techniques that we see? We'll all talk a little bit about video, obviously video, question on video coming up. How to access videos on demand has just popped up on the screen there. Yeah, they'll become available, I believe, afterwards in the links through that gets sent through on the emails for you. But how do you get visibility is what we're going to talk about into who's being targeted and how they're responding to, how your employees are responding to the threats that they might actually be facing. And as I said, we'll talk about AI-driven detection. How do we catch some of those subtle language-based threats? And then we'll kind of finish up by talking about a human-centric approach to security, how we can look beyond just email security. Because if we consider email security in isolation now, well, maybe we're not creating the most effective defense that we can for our organization. And we need to think about this as being a little bit bigger and taking a more human-centric approach. So that's a lot to cover, but we're going to pack that into the next hour. And as we said, if you have questions on the content as we're going through, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box. We'll do our best to kind of track those. And if we can, we'll address some of those as we go along as well. And we'll have an opportunity at the end to address some more Q&A as well. Okay, so yesterday we talked about those threats, right? Obviously you understand now the types of threats that are facing your organizations. At Proofpoint, we obviously see a lot of the volume. We get to see what customers are facing on a regular basis. And these challenges that are on the screen here, they're probably no surprise to you, right? Chris told us yesterday about the big increase in phishing that we're seeing. And in fact, the human factor report came out from Proofpoint just recently, and it talked about the increase in the credential phishing. So there's no surprises there that you're having to deal with more threats arriving in the inbox. Similarly, increases in social engineering attacks like business email compromise. And let's decipher that acronym. BEC is something that you'll hear quite a bit, business email compromise. It's effectively imposter fraud. It's social engineering. It's someone taking on the personality and the identity of somebody else, or at least attempting to, and then sending you messages and obviously trying to trick you into either sending money or running their code, and all those examples that we heard yesterday. So business email compromise, it can be spoof type accounts, but it can also be actual full account takeovers as well. I want to get that acronym in there now because we'll mention it a few times as we go through, and I'm sure I won't remember to go back and remind you that business email compromise is effectively social engineering and imposter fraud. We talked yesterday about those toad attacks, those telephone-oriented attack delivery, and again, we're seeing lots of increase in those. But I guess the big takeaway here is a lot of these threats are incredibly more targeted than they ever have been, because it's so much easier now to get people's identity information, to get your email address, to actually construct a message to you that makes sense to you. So instead of being just completely thrown out there to the whole world, these types of threats, those are not really the massively targeted, and they're often much easier to detect and to pick up. What we're seeing is a huge increase in the number of targeted threats, the threats that will actually perhaps target people in particular job roles or perhaps individuals within the organization. You'll start to see people within the organization that actually become way more attacked or very attacked compared to many other people. And those are threats can include business email compromise. It can include ransomware and payment fraud attacks in there as well. And we'll also talk a little bit around disruption to work, because actually this is one of the big challenges that organizations face. And in fact, in our third session tomorrow, We'll talk a lot about how actually we can deal with this very effectively. Yesterday we mentioned subscription bombing or spam bombing. We talked a little bit about the definitions of grey mail, and again we'll dive more into grey mail tomorrow. But being that bucket of unwanted messages that, yeah, maybe you subscribed to that news list once and maybe you didn't. How do we deal with those? So the challenges that we face, but both from an end user productivity perspective, but also from a security operations perspective, are also key. How do we deal with reported emails when we need to triage them? How do we respond to those? Again, that third bucket is what we're going to spend a lot more time on tomorrow. But we know today that your employees do struggle with today's targeted attacks, with those attacks that we see. We did a State of the Fish survey, I think it was at the back end of last year, and it suggested that 96% of people who take risky actions are actually aware that they're taking some form of risky action. In other words, we're walking into risk knowingly that we're taking a risk. Now, you have to gauge that level of risk, right? Because I take risks every single day. I mean, I live in the UK, and when I walk outside the door of my house, if I'm not taking an umbrella with me, I'm taking a risk because it might rain. Now, of course, I can minimize that risk by checking the weather and saying, oh, it's less likely to rain today. I can get away without an umbrella. So, judge this on that type of kind of merit, if you like. We all take risks knowingly. And in fact, we should take risks to a certain degree, but you have to understand those levels of degree. And so it's on us to actually educate our employees to make sure that they have that benchmark, to make sure that they can take the right decisions and take the right risks or no risk where it's appropriate. Because we also know that 94% of human targeted attacks, they actually initiated via email. And that one comes from the Verizon data breach report. Again, I think it was back in 24, that particular number. But it kind of gives you an idea. I mean, in fact, you've only got to look at all of the breach notifications, all of the incident reports that kind of get published out in the news. If you track them all back, they pretty much all start with an email at some point or another. They pretty much all start with a phishing attempt, which leads to a compromised account, which leads to the next stage, and it goes on from there. Yet the vast majority of incidents are generally human targeted in some way, shape or form. And the reason for that is because there's money at the end of the day for the cyber criminals, and the IBM cost of a data breach kind of puts that cost of those incidents, certainly the larger incidents that they were investigating, at around on average $4.8 million. And that's kind of huge. I mean, clearly that's looking at large enterprises, but that kind of just gives you an idea of the sort of challenge that organizations are facing, because that can just be one email that finds its way through. Now, we talked yesterday about the impact of AI on a lot of the threats that we see, and Security Magazine actually published something that said that around about 40% of BEC emails, so those imposter fraud emails that we talked about, they're generated with some form of AI. They've got signs of being generated by AI. Now, that's really, really interesting. Now, of course, if you recall back yesterday, we were having a conversation with Chris, and I was saying, actually, I use AI regularly to help me make my emails better. So it's no surprise that threat actors are exactly doing the same. And so we have to consider those indicators when we're looking at those emails threats that are coming through. Now, for most organizations, we tend to see that the vast majority of organizations are probably using Microsoft 365. Some might be using Google Workspace. There might be other platforms that you're using in there as well, but the majority are using Microsoft 365. And the good news for us is that we've got some great visibility into the threats that organizations that are running Microsoft 365 face. Because obviously here at Proofpoint, we're protecting a lot of those organizations. And so we can kind of get this kind of view as to, it gives us a great point of observability, if you like, as to what is going on in the threat landscape. And last year, we actually observed an increase in the volume of email threats that were actually going through Microsoft 365, arriving in people's inboxes. which of course there's kind of no surprise in that, because nothing's a silver bullet, right? Nothing stops absolutely everything. And of course, Microsoft are doing their best to improve their detection capabilities, but it's very clear that attackers are getting better, faster. And of course, that leads to an impact. That leads to an impact, of course, increasing risk, and it leads to an impact on your security operation as well, because ultimately that leads to more incidents being reported that require investigation, and that will have some kind of impact on from there as well. But ultimately, it ends up increasing the level of risk that an organization faces. And so that's effectively the challenge that a lot of organizations are looking to address. How can they supplement Microsoft and say, actually, how can I make it better? How can I help Microsoft stop more threats? How can I prevent more of these threats arriving through in people's inboxes? And that's the challenge ultimately that we're all faced with. And for that, we kind of want to talk about architecture as to how we design architecture for email security, because email security has been around as long as email itself. And if you take the case of Microsoft 365, well, it's got an email security gateway actually already built into it, so it's doing a certain amount of filtering and cleaning up for you. But since the start of time, there has always been, I guess, this view that said, before we let an email in, let's check it, let's make sure it's clean. Yeah, that's kind of almost like the perimeter security, if you like, the models that we used to kind of follow in the past. And that's really where the secure email gateway architecture was born out of. Your secure email gateway, or SEG, as I'll refer to it as we go forward, that becomes the front door for most of us that have got, most of us that are using, for example, Microsoft, they'll be using, perhaps you might be using Microsoft's built-in gateway. And that's effectively a SEG that's in there. Or you might be supplementing that and actually applying Proofpoint, for example, or another piece of technology in front of that as well, in order to increase your efficacy, for example. So secure email architecture is a pre-delivery model that says, hey, the email's coming through. I'm going to check that email before it arrives into the user's mailbox, before I deliver it to the mail server, make sure it's good. If it's good at that point, I'll let it go forward. And of course, in times gone by, that determination of whether something is good or bad was pretty much done by reputation. Is the sending host, does it have good reputation? Are there characteristics in the message? Are there particular signatures that this message is hitting that I need to block, for example? In times gone by, it was very much a yes, it's good, or no, it's not. And we'll kind of let it through, or we won't. We'll block it and throw it away at that point. And that was kind of, as I said, the SEG model. And in order to do that, you reconfigure your DNS, so the domain name system for your domain, and say, right, all emails need to be sent to this gateway. And hopefully you'll configure multiple gateways in there for resilience and redundancy to say, right, all emails for my domain get sent to this gateway does its work, and then it delivers my messages on. That's the traditional model for SEG. Now, there's a newer approach referred to as the API approach. And this approach doesn't necessarily do away with the gateway or the SEG model, because any messages still coming in are still going to, for example, go straight into Microsoft 365. They're going to go through Microsoft's gateway. But this approach actually connects through to the mailboxes and the mail server to examine messages post-delivery. So they've gone through, they've arrived, they've landed in the inbox, and by using APIs, cloud-based APIs, we can connect an email security service back through to the mailbox to read the emails and to take any additional action. Now, this is also often referred to as an integrated cloud email security system, or ICES, depending on which analyst firm or whoever you're talking to. Everyone seems to have a different label for this, but ultimately it uses APIs and it's post-delivery. So the difference between the two are pre-delivery and post-delivery. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Secure email gateway, the SEG route. Let's follow the mail flow here. So we've got an email out on the internet on the far left-hand side. The email is sent to you at yourdomain.com. The domain lookup takes place, works out it needs to go to this email gateway. The message is delivered to that email gateway. And of course, then at that point, the email gateway can then go off and do any necessary analysis that it does, check all the various signatures, checking the reputation. And as you'll see in a little bit, we'll talk about all the AI analysis that can take place at this point and the sandboxing and everything else. We'll go into that in a second. All of that happens in the email security service itself. And if at that point we're like, okay, we can deliver the message on, it's then passed through to the mailbox and then onto the client. Right, so it's a kind of an inline approach, if you like. Messages, first of all, to the email security provider, from there to the mailbox, and the mailbox to the user at that point. That's the standard architecture approach, right? That's the standard secure email gateway approach. Now, the second approach that we spoke about was what we referred to as the API approach, the API email security service architecture. And you can see here that this one is quite different. In the case of this one, the message gets sent, again, using the same domain name system, and is delivered then to, if you're in the case of Microsoft 365, it's delivered directly to Microsoft's infrastructure at that point. Now, they will run some security scanning. They will try and determine, based on reputation and some other factors, whether it's a good message. And at that point, we'll then drop it into the user's inbox. Now, the email security service provider, the way that it connects in is through APIs to, in this case, Microsoft's cloud. Equally could be to Google or to another provider if it's configured up that way. But in this case, we're talking about Microsoft here. So we're hooking in through API to Microsoft. We're enumerating all the messages as they come in and drop into people's mailboxes. We're examining those messages, determining whether they're good or whether they're bad, and then taking the appropriate response. And that appropriate response might be get rid of the message, it might be drop it into quarantine, it might be, delete the message completely, it might be put banners on the message, lots of options in there. We'll talk about some of those both today and perhaps more so tomorrow, actually, when we go into it. Now, interesting question popped up in the chat. Is it a good idea to use both? So that is a really, really good question. And actually, the answer is probably yes for some organizations. Because we talked about these two different models. One is pre-delivery and one is post-delivery. The pre-delivery one, the whole idea with pre-delivery is the more that you can stop pre-delivery is the further away you keep the threats from the user, right? The less bad messages that will find their way to the inbox, the less incidents that then will get generated, because these bad messages have not found their way into your infrastructure. They've not been reported. No one's flagged it to the SOC. No incidents needs to be raised and to be dealt with. And so it's this whole idea of kind of shifting the protection left. It's the further away we keep the threat, the less problem it is for us and for the users. So that's one thing to consider. Absolutely. Now, of course, messages will get delivered, right? Messages, and in fact, the status of a message might even change. And again, we will go into this in a lot more detail tomorrow. But if you imagine if I sent you a link, an email with a link to a URL today, and that URL pointed to a website and the website was all good, well, the message might find its way through to your inbox. But if the website perhaps changed tomorrow and becomes malicious, the destination of that link becomes malicious tomorrow, well, of course, the status of the message effectively needs to change at that point. And so we need a mechanism to go in and deal with that. And that mechanism could then become through API, because it gives us a great way to access and do post-delivery remediation and triage and analysis as well. So best of both worlds might be a good option for some organizations. And then interestingly, someone's pointed out, well, does Proofpoint offer both options? Yes, actually, Proofpoint offer both options. You have the capabilities to choose both options with Proofpoint. Now, which one do you choose? Which is the better architecture for me? Well, this is one of the big questions. And we've spent a lot of time talking and working with organizations to try and help them profile themselves and find them, put themselves in the right bracket, if you like, to have the right deployment method. Now, you're not exclusively locked into any one of these at any point. You can change it, of course. But which one of these models looks more appropriate to my organization? And it kind of comes down to, I guess, three key criteria. The first being time to value. Does your organization have the time and the resources to be able to fine tune and configure the secure email gateway? Do you have perhaps quite an extensive security operation and you want to be able to go in and do all that advanced management? Well, if that's the case, then a secure email gateway may be a really good option for you. If not, if you're looking for more of a hands-off approach and actually you're just looking for something to plug the gaps for Microsoft first of all, and remove those threats automatically for you without a lot of that additional configuration, then maybe API may be a good route for you. Similarly, if your Microsoft orientation, if you're all in Microsoft, and if you're looking just for a straightforward deployment and you don't want to reconfigure your MX records and make any domain changes, then again, API might be a good route for your organization. But if you've got a complex email infrastructure with, a good point in the chat there, someone's put, Microsoft is never straightforward though. Well, it can be. It can be if you're using it the right way. But yeah, absolutely. If you've got a complex email infrastructure with multiple domains, with complex policies, yeah, if there's complexity there, then the SEG route might be the good one for you, because generally the SEG has those advanced email delivery capabilities. It can route mails based on certain criteria in different locations. You can handle a lot of those multi-domain configurations, those complex policies. You can do all that customization, but generally the API route is often a lot less customizable. It's just plug straight into Microsoft, go off, find out what we can see that is malicious at that point, that perhaps has found its way through. Then at that point we can kind of clean it up. So yeah, these are some good points to configure: when to choose SEG, when to choose the API. There is no exclusive right or wrong here. It's just really what's good for your organization. And it's generally a SEG if you're looking for comprehensive protection to keep everything away pre-delivery, rich custom configurations. You've got a big security team or a mature security team, not necessarily big. We all get a little bit bigger as we get more mature, but that's not quite what I meant there. If you've got that, then maybe the gateways are a good route for you. But if you're looking for post-delivery protection, you're looking for simple configurations because you've got a leaner security team, then perhaps API is the better route for you as well. Sometimes it can even be both, as we've mentioned, and we'll talk about some of the use cases where that comes into play more tomorrow for triage. In fact, we've got a little slide here on an overall kind of human-centric security architecture, which is, because the reality for a lot of larger organizations is that they kind of need a layered approach to security. For them, it's not just a case of, SEG versus API. In fact, in many cases, it is both. It is additional layers on top of that as well. So things that we're not talking about as part of this course, but I know we've done other courses on them, and we'll rerun those again in future times. But for example, DMARC plays a role in our whole human-centric security architecture. The usage of threat intelligence to understand the state of our suppliers, for example, also plays a role. How are we using real-time threat intelligence to feed that in to make decisions as to how we should treat emails from our suppliers? How are we handling security awareness? What are we doing for account takeover protection? All of that kind of comes into play into an overall human-centric security architecture that, again, we'll go into a lot more of those areas in a future date as well for you, to make sure that we cover off courses on them. Right, I'm just going to pause for 1 second. Let me jump back just 2 slides here, because there's a couple of questions came through as we were making those decisions as to whether we're looking at SEG or whether we're looking at API. So question here: does the API architecture check all emails that are in the inbox on a regular basis to check whether the status of any email has changed from legitimate to malicious? The answer there is it can. Of course, it depends very much on the email security provider. But if there is reason to, then yes. So give you an example with proof points threat intelligence. When we see emails come through with URLs, it's not just a case of just making a decision once on a URL. We will regularly take a look at those URLs. If we see status change, for example, there may be reason for that to be fed back round and then to take action. So yes, there are capabilities around that. There are different use cases and scenarios where that could come into play. But equally, sometimes you're not always just checking the actual state of the URL. Sometimes you're actually looking at the probability of whether a URL is malicious or not, and taking decisions around on that as well. And a question around timing. So what about timing? So Yeah, that's a really good point. So, of course, if you're going the seg route is all about pre-delivery protection, right? So you're blocking the messages before they arrive at the inbox. So that's the pre-delivery route. So you've never got the situation where, particularly if you've got an organization with great efficacy, like Proofpoint, for example, our tests are regularly showing that we're getting, 99.99% efficacy on the front end, which is awesome. But what about from a timing perspective on the back end? If you haven't got that barrier, if you haven't got that seg at the front end, messages get delivered, how quickly do they get fed back round? Well, the APIs, there are post notifications that kind of take place, and so generally it's you're talking around the sort of milliseconds mark, the 500 millisecond mark for messages to kind of be picked up. That will vary, and some of that to a certain degree becomes out of your control because you're reliant on, in this case, for example, Microsoft's APIs and the speed and the performance of that. So it is something to factor in. But that is part of the trade-off. If you want the simplicity approach, if you want to keep it nice and easy, then the API route might be for you. But if you're looking to stop everything up front, then perhaps the seg route is for you in that case. So there are kind of trade-offs as we said there. Okay, we'll come back to a few more of these questions a little bit later on. But just one further, in fact, just one last one that's just cropped up here isn't that what Proofpoint Tap and Trap are doing, what the API option is doing? So for those of you that are already using Proofpoint technology, if you're using the Proofpoint, effectively the seg architecture, if you like, using core email protection that's got what we call tap capabilities in there, the sandboxing capabilities, all of that's happening pre-delivery. And then Trap is connecting in post-delivery and connecting through APIs in order to do some of that post-delivery remediation and triage if you need it in there. Okay, so we're looking at this architecture here during both the pre and the post-delivery stage, because even when you're doing post-delivery, you're still getting, for example, attachment sandboxing that's taking place, and malicious messages are still being checked with exactly the same. In the case of Proofpoint, with exactly the same technology. So all the technology that's taking place in models that are analyzing emails pre-delivery, we're also doing all of that post-delivery as well. So regardless of whether it's pre-delivery or post-delivery, with Proofpoint, it's effectively the same efficacy. You're getting the same levels of protection. So, which is why we offer that choice, right? Because there's no point us giving you a choice to say where one's not as good as the other, because that's simply not the case. We've engineered it in such a way that we can run all of these models. And we need to run all of these models to get the same levels of efficacy, both pre-delivery and post-delivery, because it is a lot of these new types of threats that we discussed yesterday that are finding their way through to the inbox, that will get through, for example, a lot of those Microsoft defenses, and will find their way through to the inbox. So therefore, you need something additional to supplement Microsoft with, whether that's these fake invoice scams or QR code scams, all of those that we've kind of talked about. So in order to deliver that efficacy, we have to look inside the black box a little bit. We have to look inside the actual analysis that we're doing. How are we checking the messages? What intelligence are we using to examine those messages? And if efficacy is the goal, we need to train on data. We need to understand data. And within Proofpoint, we have a number of different machine learning and large language models that we use in order to examine these email messages as they're coming through or in a post-delivery state. But the big thing with machine learning and large language models is that you have to train on the right data. If you train on bad data, or if you put bad in, you'll get bad out ultimately. So if you put good threat data in, if you've got more data, ultimately that can lead to more training, better efficacy, and it becomes kind of this circle, if you like. And so in the example of Proofpoint, we see approximately about a third of the world's emails every single day, which gives us a great grounding for threat data and intelligence to train our large language models, to train our machine learning models for efficacy. And we can kind of continuously do that on a regular basis. So the more data we have, the better the models become, the greater the efficacy becomes. And this ultimately leads to the reason as to why you find Proofpoint having greater efficacy and being able to be in the right position to be able to supplement your Microsoft environment, because you're going to get more threats being stopped. Regardless of whether you choose that pre-delivery or post-delivery deployment model, the efficacy effectively becomes the same. So let's look at those models. And again, I'm using Proofpoint here as a technology example. When you're out in the market, if you're looking at vendors, this is the sort of technology, the level you should be going into to try and understand how their black box looks. You know, what is the analysis that they're doing here at this point? Within Proofpoint, we operate a number of different distilled AI models. You know, for example, we have a language model for BEC, a large language model, which is, it's an AI model that's been built to kind of understand and to reason and to generate, and in some cases, it's looking at the content and the context of messages to understand language. Now, you might say, well, that's ChatGPT, right? That's what ChatGPT are doing. And of course, these models, they're all composed of many layers. They're incredibly complex. And an example of ChatGPT, obviously it's been trained on the world's data. It's been opened up to the web and said, go train. And it's come back and it's got this amazing level of knowledge. But with that amazing level of knowledge becomes a computational load, a heavy computational load. Let me give you an example. It might be helpful to understand the works of Shakespeare. If I'm writing a dissertation, for example, on English literature, but your emails that come through into your organization from threat actors probably aren't quoting Hamlet in your BEC attacks. And so therefore, we don't necessarily need to train on the complete works of Shakespeare when we're creating large language models for email security. So the focus here, to be computationally efficient, is to run these distilled AI models, is to train these distilled AI models for particular tasks. So as an example, there'll be machine learning models specifically for business email compromise. There'll be models specifically for computer vision. These models that continuously get trained, because again, there's always more threat data coming in, which leads to greater training, which leads to improvements in the models, which leads to better efficacy. But all of these models perform different tasks at any given time on those messages. And they'll be running both pre and post delivery. And of course, that then helps us achieve the levels of efficacy that we're talking about here. And as an example, there are some exclusively that perhaps may only run post delivery, and that, such as the relationship graph. Because who you communicate with becomes one of those signals that we talked about yesterday as to whether we should consider a message malicious or not. If all of a sudden you're starting to get emails from a colleague in another organization externally to you that you don't often talk about invoicing and doesn't often use urgency, well, maybe that's something in your relationship graph as an indicator that says, oh, this could be a message that perhaps we need to pay a bit more attention to. So we'll add a level of suspicion around that. The key takeaway here is it's no longer a case of static detection. It's no longer a case of just sandbox analysis either. It is now a case of understanding the content and the context of the message. And in order to do that, the most effective and efficient way to do that has been proven to become AI and machine learning. And the most effective and efficient ways that you can create those models is by using the best data, and by using the most data, and by using the right data. And that is ultimately what we're looking to do here. So in practice, what does this look like? And again, this kind of goes back to the point of multiple characteristics here. This is an example of a QR code type attack email that kind of comes through. And you can see here that one of the machine learning models has immediately identified that as to say, hey, there's some reply to manipulation that's happened here. We've got a suspicious domain name, a suspicious display name. We've done some language analysis and some relationship graph analysis here to kind of understand that. We've used a computer vision model to understand actually it's a QR code, and it's a QR code that perhaps points to a suspicious URL, not necessarily malicious, but a suspicious URL, either one perhaps we haven't seen before, maybe one that is hosted on a provider that is known to host malicious files, for example. Oh, and by the way, we can see some intent in the message as well, We're looking at the language models has picked up some intent here for urgency. Said, hey, failure to reply within the next 24 hours or 48 hours could result in a loss. So you can see here, it's all about multiple signals that are coming through. And a lot of these signals will come through from the various different machine learning models. And here it is again addressing a different type of scam. This one's a gift card scam. And it could have come through from actually from a compromised account in this case. And you can see the different models that are firing at different points. Depending on, for example, what's in the header and what's in the content of the message. So the relationship graph has picked up on, said, oh, it's a suspicious domain in this case. The threat intelligence has come back and said, actually, that domain, as well as being suspicious, was only just recently registered. The relationship graph comes back and says, but you also haven't had an email from this recipient before. So this is a first-time relationship. And there's some urgency in the language because the language models have come back and said, can you do this thing quickly for me? Picked up on the urgency. Can you buy this for me? It's picked up on the action that's being asked on there as well. And again, all of these characteristics combine in order to help us make some form of determination as to whether a message becomes malicious, or perhaps we should treat it as suspicious and provide any additional indicators to the end users from there. And some of those additional indicators might be contextual warning banners. Now, we'll go into contextual warning banners a little bit more tomorrow when we're talking about how we notify people on levels of suspicion. But essentially, messages aren't always malicious, but there might be enough indicators there for me to say, I'm going to let it go to the user, but I'm going to perhaps put a warning banner on the top that says, hey, be careful with this, because I'm not entirely convinced that it is legitimate. We just want you to pay attention to it. Having that capability to put those warning banners in place often is a key characteristic that organizations should be looking for when they're designing their email security architecture. Another aspect that can be critical as well is visibility. And this is often something that is a bit of a goldmine that organizations often just let go by. Knowing what threats are targeting your organization can really empower your security team to better defend and reduce risk. Because if you know what threats are hitting your domain, what threats are hitting your people, well, you can kind of then start to dig into all the reasons why. Who's being targeted with what, for what reasons? What risk am I being faced as an organization as a result of that? So getting visibility into the detection. This is just one example. And again, I'm showing you an example of a screenshot from a Proofpoint dashboard here, but principles are the same regardless. You should be looking for this level of visibility that says, oh, actually, we've got like 16 million messages coming on the inbound flow, and we can see that we got rid of about half of those just through sender intelligence, and actually commodity threats dropped another almost 900, well, you can see there 900,000. And then actually from there, some of those advanced threats, another 3,000, some additional credential phishing that was picked up, BEC threats from there, which ultimately led to, in this case, just almost 7 million messages actually being delivered. So you can see the sort of volumes of threats your organization is facing, and you can immediately report on that. What level of threat does the organization face? What risk are we exposed to at any given time? And if we know it at an organization level, you can take it further by understanding it at an individual level. We talked earlier about a lot of the threats now becoming very much more targeted. Well, yeah, an email is a targeted thing. If you send me an email, that's targeted to me. Now, if that email contains a malicious threat or perhaps has a level of suspicion over it, well, we should surely be recording that and monitoring that and saying, actually, yeah, we can see that this particular threat actor at the moment is targeting 3 people in our finance organization with business email compromise scams. Now, if we've got that level of visibility, of course, now we can start to feed that into other areas of the organization, like security awareness training, and take advantage of it from there as well. But from a reporting perspective, if we're armed with that intelligence, you can then start to get views into what we call very attacked people. Who in your organization is attacked the most? has the most targeted threats that face them. Therefore, where does my risk lie? Because if you know that Matt's being targeted with way more threats than anybody else, well, you could suggest then that perhaps Matt has a lot more risk associated with him, and we needed to do a better job then to kind of understand that and help empower Matt, so that perhaps we can enroll Matt in the right training, so that when one of those threats does get through, because it will, because nothing's 100% effective, because it will get through at some point or another, Matt's in a better position to be armed to be able to deal with that. So being able to understand who your very attacked people are, it's a huge level of insight. But not only that, to be able to then compare your organisation with other organisations out there as well. It helps from a reporting perspective. You can say, hey, this is what we look like compared to this is what that other company that we're competing against looks like, in the biscuit making industry that we happen to be in at any one given time. Because Proofpoint has this vast amount of intelligence and we're protecting a huge amount of the world's organisations, we have millions of customers, we're able to give you that level of visibility to say, actually, this is what your attack profile looks like compared to the standard in your industry. So if there's something different about you that you should be responding to, for example. And then, of course, you can use that threat data to visualize that risk. If we know, for example, who's being targeted the most, we've already said that presents risk, but we can add to that other factors. We can add to that, for example, let's say Matt's being targeted the most in the organization, right? Let's say I'm the VP of finance, I got a promotion. I get a lot of threats coming through to me that are specifically targeted to me. Now, being the VP of finance, I have a lot of privilege. I have access to money. I have access to sensitive information. Now, if we also know, for example, that I'm susceptible to phishing simulations, and I often click on links in phishing simulation emails, we know that I'm quite vulnerable as well. We know that I have a level of vulnerability. So if we can combine these multiple metrics together, now we have a much clearer view of what human risk looks like. Because if I'm the most attacked, have all the privilege, and are vulnerable as well, well, then clearly that needs to be a problem that we need to be able to take action with. So the more risk signals that we can feed into that model, the greater the understanding of risk that we have as an organization, and then the more that we can then go off and deal with it with the right form of actions. And again, this is kind of leading into what we were saying at the very start by saying, you know what, you could look at email security in isolation. If all you're looking to do is just stop bad emails coming through, fine. If that's the simple method, absolutely, you can do that. But in order to actually really deploy a human-centric security strategy, there are additional signals that we kind of want to feed in from other security technology solutions, like your CASB, for example, like your endpoint, like security awareness, like your insider threat management, combining all of that in. And again, this is where email security has evolved to being from, just being email security now to being more around human-centric risk management. You get those views and you get the ability to take actionable actions off the back of the insight. Identifying the riskiest users, automating those controls. For example, again, another example, we've already said about the training example, but another one might be, well, Matt's being targeted a lot right now. Maybe we think that Matt's account is at risk of being compromised, so we might share that information automatically with Okta to say, hey, make Matt re-authenticate a couple of times during the day, just so that we can make sure that Matt is who he says he is and that the account hasn't been compromised. Just one example of one of the many different actions that you could take. And all of that kind of comes together in what we refer to as the human-centric platform architecture. Right? It isn't just email security in isolation anymore. It's way more than that. But it is very much underpinned by all those machine learning models that we kind of talked about that will help effectively detect those malicious threats that kind of come through. And it's all of that intelligence that allows us to then take the right actions through. We've got the intelligence, we've got the visibility. We can then take actions through the control points going on from there. So that's effectively the blueprint, if you like, for that human-centric security platform that email security itself has evolved into becoming. Right. We're going to dive into some Q&A. So now's the time. If you've got those questions, stick a few more in the chat, and we'll kind of run through. I'll pick a few of these out as we can kind of go through. Is this a big data analytics approach? Yeah, it absolutely is. Again, as we kind of said before, I mean, I'm telling you about Proofpoint's experience in this as the market leader, but you could apply this, or hopefully you would apply this to any other vendor. But ultimately, the more visibility they've got, the better data they've got, the way they can train the models is vastly more improved than if you have good data, more data. Ultimately, you train the models themselves become more effective as a result of that. If you only train it on a subset of information, on a small amount of data, you've only seen a small amount of threats, the actions that the models will take or the predictions that the models will make perhaps will become less effective. So it is a kind of a big data approach. Does this mean that our company's data will be shown to others to compare? Actually, well, no, not really. So it very much depends, right? So obviously that's something, again, talking specifically in the Proofpoint world, it's something that you get to control. But no, not specifically, but we're talking about anonymized industry statistics. So you can take an anonymous view on that. But again, that's something that you can kind of control. And that was when you're comparing your risk profile to somebody else. Okay, so a couple of questions. How much accuracy can we expect from these models? Yeah, so that's a really good question. So accuracy and efficacy obviously go hand in hand. In theory, the more accurate the models, the more the greater efficacy you'll experience. In other words, the less threats that will find their way through to the inbox, or the more threats that will be cleaned out in the inbox, depending on which of the two types of deployment models you choose to take. And again, our approach very much is that the more data you've got, the better the way you can train the models, the greater efficiency you can kind of gain. The good news, and again, this is probably something that everybody should be looking at, is when you're looking at every email security vendor, you need to be having questions about what's happening in R&D and how much is being invested in R&D. And what's happening here at Proofpoint is you're constantly seeing new models being introduced over time. And those new models will get introduced to address particular types of threats or to improve efficiency of other models. And generally, you might find, actually, this model has almost become redundant because there's another one running. And a lot of this you won't ever get to see. This is kind of what's inside the black box, if you like. But I guess the key takeaway here is, the bigger the organization, ultimately, you should expect greater efficacy from that. If you see more volumes of data, you should expect greater efficacy. And that is obviously there to be proven. And the best way to prove that, honestly, is just run it on your environment. Particularly if you're already using Microsoft 365, you can very quickly enable, like a proof of concept for the API email security, and it's going to tell you, actually, this is the additional levels of protection you're going to get over and above what you've got at the minute. So very, very much so you should expect greater efficacy from these models. Question here, is the data being used to train the Nexus models shared across all tenants, specifically within Proofpoint, when additional services like, as interesting, like Tessium, for example, are integrated? So around data sharing and the models. Yes, is the simple answer. So you made a reference there to an organization called Tessium. Proofpoint acquired Tessium a couple of years ago, I think it was now. And actually what we've done is taken their, they had an excellent API connection capabilities. And we've taken all of the Proofpoint models that we already had the great, wonderful efficacy from and integrated them into that technology. So actually we end up running the same models now across the entire platform. So you can expect the same levels of efficacy regardless of whether you're deploying Proofpoint as a seg or Proofpoint as an API option. That's something that is very unique to Proofpoint though, right? That's not clearly that. I think we're the only vendor that will offer you the choice of both deployment models anyway. But that is effectively the work that we've done since that acquisition. So it is models, or I should say it is models that are run in parallel across all of the deployment methods that we have. Question on click time detection. Yeah, something we didn't mention. It did flash up on one of the slides. But does click time detection work similarly in a pre and post delivery model? There are options to do exactly that and to achieve the kind of the same goals. Often what you have on pre-delivery is you can do URL rewriting when messages come through. In a post-delivery world, you wouldn't necessarily always have those same options to go back in and change the URLs within messages, but you do have options, for example, to use browser plugins to achieve exactly the same results, and isolation technology as well within there. So yes, it can, in short, it can be architected to achieve the same results, but the architecture itself might look slightly different for the two worlds. How secure are our emails when distilled by AI? Well, right. So really good question. So yeah, obviously you're signing, in order to use an email security service, you are allowing that email security service provider the permissions, if you like, to examine those emails and determine whether they are good or whether they are bad. And so, yeah, within that, there are obviously contractual things that permit that analysis to take place. There are also contractual things in there that allow some of that metadata, for example, to then be used for things like learning and onwards from there. But essentially, emails themselves become anonymized before they go through that process. The data itself becomes anonymized as well, and you get full control over that. So, in short, very secure. And that's the bread and butter, if you like, of the business. Good question here on false positive or reporting false positive and negative cases. I'm going to hold that one till tomorrow. And the reason I'm going to do that is because we're going to talk about that at some length tomorrow, and some really simple ways or simple things that you should be looking for to introduce into your workflows to do things like reporting, hey, your vendor missed a bad email, or we want to block this email, or you want to release this email. All those processes and workflows, we'll cover that in tomorrow's session. Scanning through. Good question here about internal threats. This is a really good one, actually, because we didn't cover this off specifically. There isn't a question on the exam about this, so don't worry about this one. But it's a really good point to make. So thank you for making it. If I'm deploying the secure email gateway architecture, how do you scan internal emails? That is a really good question, because if you look at this architecture as it stands, well, there's nothing in there that is scanning those emails. So you do need to consider, how am I going to do that? And it might be a case that you have to configure some rules that actually tell Microsoft 365, for example, to send the messages back out to an email scanning service. Or perhaps the easier approach is to hook in through APIs. So if the use case is scanning internal emails as well, hooking in through APIs is probably going to be way easier for you, because you just enable the API access. And in fact, the process of enabling that API access is probably only about 5 minutes and a few clicks. And once you've enabled that, you've then got your security provider's then got visibility into all the messages that are going internally as well, so that you can, obviously then pick out any particularly malicious messages that are taking place. And in fact, that does lean towards one of the comments in the chat around, insider threat detection. It gives you the opportunity to start looking for that as well, which is some of the advanced functionalities that you do get access to, particularly if you're looking down the API route, because there are additional DLP capabilities within there as well that you can add. Question here: why isn't the post-delivery API solution done before the email hits the mailbox? That's a really good question. So this model is obviously entirely at the mercy of the mailbox provider and the APIs that they will allow access to. And what they're not looking to do is, of course, they don't want to hold up emails. When an email arrives, it needs to go into the mailbox at that point. They don't want to hold up the email and wait for a vendor to scan it through API before delivering it on. So typically they will hit the mailbox. But we generally, it's, as I said before, it is only typically a case of only milliseconds before those messages are picked up. And a lot of organizations will determine that, that trade-off, I'm happy with that, and I will deploy that. But if you're not happy with that, then pre-delivery protection is probably the way to go in that case. Okay, another one here. API service will work like once we got an email, it will redirect, check with Microsoft. Okay, yeah. So this again, I guess this is a case of delivery. So the way that to understand the API service, the best way to think about it is it kicks into action once the message has landed in the inbox. So it's gone through all of any complex routing and anything else that's taking place. Once the message lands, away it goes from there. Okay, now I'm conscious we are very much up on time, so I did want to thank the ridiculous amount of you that have stayed on right to the end. This is awesome, and I do hope this is proving useful information.